Good morning. This is the Public Affairs Forum, sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. We're located in North Central Austin, 4700 Grover Avenue. The purpose of these Public Affairs Forums is to fulfill the mission of the church, that is, to transform lives and do justice, and we hope they achieve that end. This church was incorporated in 1954, and we've been holding these Public Affairs Forums since that time. As far as we know, it is the longest continuously serving public affairs forum in the state of Texas. These affairs are held every Sunday, except for the dead of summer. We hold them during the summer from noon to 1 o'clock. They are free and open to the public, and we'd invite you to come and join us. For additional information, you can look at our church website, austinuu.org. My name is Luther Elmore, and today we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Sharon Hausman-Cohen. Dr. Cohen has been a family physician in Austin for over 20 years. She recently added a second board certification in integrative medicine and is one of 40 physicians in the United States trained on a highly specialized protocol of Alzheimer's and reversal of memory loss developed by Dr. Dale Bredesen of Buck Institute on Aging. Her interests in integrative medicine date back to the 1990s when she was a student at Harvard Medical School. Her medical areas of interest include optimizing health and nutrition, cognition, osteoporosis, fatigue, and endocrine issues. She considers genetics, nutrition, vitamin, mineral deficiencies, environmental, and lifestyle issues. Dr. Hausman-Cohen looks at the role of vitamins, supplements, exercise, and genetics in improving mood, memory, and cognition. Today, she will talk about that and how we can improve our mood and memory now and our cognition in the future. And it's a great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Hausman-Cohen with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So as Luther said, today our talk is on preserving mood, memory, and cognition. And as we go through this, you're going to see how they all relate. I take an integrative approach as I am dual board certified in family medicine and integrative medicine. And many times people say, what is integrative medicine? And it's not just, oh, let's add some acupuncture, let's add some vitamins, let's add some supplements. It's a different approach. It's saying, let's see if we can't figure out what is the underlying problem or the underlying condition causing the symptoms and address the underlying condition with an approach, which the underlying condition might have to do with different deficiencies, genetics, environmental exposures, hormones, autoimmune issues, many, many different issues. But let's try to look at what happened and what's the underlying situation and how we can actually correct it. We do use medications at times, but we also use supplements, nutrition, exercise, mitochondrial cofactors, vitamins, and other modalities. And so you're going to see this today as we talk about how we optimize our mood, memory, and cognition. We're going to start with stress and depression because those are the most pervasive, and then we will talk about some of the genetic and environmental influences on mood as well as memory, and then we're going to go into the cognitive. Let's start with looking at mood and memory and mood and depression. So I'm a scientist by training, so I'm going to start with the basic science. Your brain, in order to grow new neurons, needs growth factors. Think of it as fertilizer. One of the brain growth factors is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You have some neurons that you've had in place since you were a baby. You've been able to walk for decades and use your arms and your muscles, but you constantly need to grow new neurons if you want to be able to change your emotions, if you want to be able to put new memories into your brain. So BDNF is a growth factor that allows brain tissue to grow. When you lose neurons, you lose memory. And if you don't have enough BDNF, you will have loss of memory and loss of neuronal function. When you get depressed or you're under any other stressful state, your BDNF levels, your brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels, go low. Depression itself is a stressful state for any of you who have ever been depressed or known someone who is depressed. And what happens is during any stressful state, your cortisol levels can go high, which is kind of your brain's fight or flight response. And cortisol additionally makes BDNF go low. So what happens is during times of stress and depression, patients' brains start to shrink. Most of the shrinkage is in the area that we're having to repair and build new neurons, the areas responsible for memory and mood. I tell people to think about it like this. You wouldn't want to have the mood end in development when you were 15. Because the planet wouldn't work very well with a planet full of teenagers from a mood standpoint. So that's a very, emotions and mood are very labile and need to change. Memory, of course it needs to change because you need to put new things constantly into your memory. So if you don't treat your depression early and completely, and you lose these neurons, you actually can see it on MRIs that you lose brain volume in those areas. Antidepressants and other depression treatments have been shown to restore the BDNF levels and not only stop that progression of neuronal loss, but actually restore the growth of these nerve factors. And once fully treated, patients with depression have normal levels of BDNF. So right now, if I were to tell you, you have hypothyroidism, you have low thyroid, I can prove to you, I can say, look, your thyroid hormone level, your TSH, they're off, we need to treat you. You actually can do the same thing with depression. It is not commercially available, but there was a test developed by a lab in Japan that you can go to the lab and check BDNF levels. And you can show that they are low in patients who have untreated depression. When you treat their depression to what's called remission, or being fully well, their BDNF levels normalize, and that's what you see here. You have the people without depression in kind of the yellow. You have the depressed patients who've been treated with the green, and you can see that's about equal. And then in blue, you have depressed patients with no treatment. This is kind of showing that relationship between stress and pain and BDNF. How many of you, when you're under stress, feel like your brains do not work as well? Most of us. And that's because BDNF levels change very quickly and cortisol levels change very quickly. So when you're either in pain or you're under stress, very, very quickly your BDNF levels drop. And so here again you can see the BDNF levels changing in the hippocampus, in the memory center, when you're with pain. And it's not a very nice animal study. They irritated a paw of a rat to be able to tell that, or with stress. And for stress, they took little rats, had big aggressive rats in the same cage. When you have loss of neurons from depression, if you don't treat your depression, this adds to your dementia risk. So each episode of major depression that ended up in a hospital, because it's easier to track those patients, has been calculated to increase the risk of dementia by 13% later in life. Now, this is an old study because now we know that if you have somebody who has depression and you treat them till they're fully well, not just a little bit better, but you treat them until they are back to normal with no symptoms of depression, and you keep them that way for years, at about 18 months, they start to really regrow the neurons measurably. So that's a good news type thing. But many seniors that are initially diagnosed with depression, when treated for, initially diagnosed with dementia, when treated for their depression, get better. Their dementia actually improves. So if you have a loved one who's diagnosed with dementia, you want to make sure that part of it is not depression. And that's partially because there's some overlap in the neurotransmitters and the brain chemicals. But we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So memory loss can be a sign of dementia, but it can also be a sign of stress or depression. So what can you do if you're not depressed, you're not under stress now, but you want to help to protect your brain from depression and stress and dementia? One of the easiest things you can do is exercise. Exercise has been shown to increase BDNF levels. Now, I have a lot of people that tell me that they exercise, and then I say, what are you doing? And they say, oh, I go walking. And I say, so how long does it take you to walk, or how far do you walk? And they're like, I walk a mile. It takes me about 30, 40 minutes. That's not really exercise, that's walking. Walking is how we get from one place to another. Exercise requires you to actually push yourself. And so in a trial of adults where they were randomized to exercise 40 minutes a week, 3 times a week, versus Zoloft, which is serotonin medicine for depression, the groups that exercised did see the same kind of improvements in depression as the Zoloft group. However, walking alone, kind of a slow walk, did not have that kind of same effect. So you had to get your heart rate going up, you had to be working at exercise, because walking even 45 minutes 3 times a week did not have the same benefits as exercising 3 times a week. So the bottom line for this, no matter what your age, so for somebody who is in their 30s or 40s or 50s, that exercising might be 3 miles of running. For somebody who's a little older, it might be brisk walking or going on the elliptical. But whatever you can do for your age, the point is you need to push yourself to get the cognitive benefits. Diet is really important in BDNF levels. And when we talk later on about cognition, you'll see this has definitely been the case in humans as well. Poor diet, which is especially a high sugar, and this is a huge factor, high sugar, high simple carbohydrates, high saturated fats have been shown, and saturated fat's not the same as total fat, to decrease this growth factor in animal models. And so at baseline, they showed that if you feed rats a poor diet, you're going to have worse memory and worse learning, they have learned mazes. Other than exercise and medications, what else can be done in people who are prone to depression? Well, let's talk about genetics for a little bit. There is a modifiable genetic risk factor. There is a gene called the MTHFR gene, which many of my patients think should be standing for mother-father, or many other things, but it actually stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. This gene is very important in making your brain chemicals. And it turns out that 70% of people who have depression have an MTHFR gene variant that makes it so it's difficult for them to get folic acid, which you get from leafy greens in your diet, into the brain. Because to convert it and get it into the brain, it has to be converted to something called methylfolate. There will not be a biochemistry quiz, but if you think about it, your brain and your nerves are covered with fat, kind of like a sheath that's in the wires, in the walls on your electric wires, and your blood is watery. In order to get the methylfolate across what's called the blood-brain barrier into the fatty part of the brain, you have to add a methyl group, a fatty group. And 70% of the population of people who are depressed are poor methylators. If you started having depression when you were still in high school or college during times of stress, there's a good chance you're a poor methylator. And if you replace methylfolate in this population, you can overcome that gene. It's very simple. So the 3 main neurotransmitters in memory, as well as very involved in mood, are dopamine, which helps with attention, pleasure, motivation, reward. Serotonin, which all of you guys have heard of serotonin, whether or not you know it, because Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro all work by increasing serotonin levels. Serotonin is what stops you from crying when you're under stress. It's very important in regulating mood. And then norepinephrine. Norepinephrine helps you with energy and motivation. So if you're a poor methylator, you don't make enough of these during times of stress. Now, additionally, when it comes to memory, there's acetylcholine, and that's a really important memory neurotransmitter. And all the Alzheimer's drugs like Aricept and Exelon and things like that work on helping you to recycle and make more of the acetylcholine, and that's also dependent on methylfolate. So you can see if you don't, you can have all the tryptophan and all the different amino acids you have, but if you don't have the methylfolate, you're not going to make those genes. You can just give, there's a prescription form called Deplin, there's over-the-counter forms, methylfolate, and overcome that gene. This kind of shows there's the genetics. If you have 2 copies of this particular gene, the C677T MTHFR gene, you'll have a 70% reduction in your ability to make methylfolate. And if you have 1 copy, you'll have a 30 to 35% 5%. So that's something that can be tested. It can be tested through places like 23andMe. It can be tested through Baylor here in Texas. Your doctor can order it in a variety of ways and can be treated. In terms of supplementing, there are prescription forms, and that's like Deplin or Serotonin NAC. There's also over-the-counter forms like MethylPro. There's vitamins, Embrace and Enlight, which are FDA approved. One is a prenatal vitamin and the other is a multivitamin that have high doses of methylfolate in them so that they can overcome these genetics. And then there's lower doses available over the counter. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the studies, but you can see here on the studies that when you combine methylfolate along with an antidepressant, you get better results at depression. So you can see that in antidepressant therapy alone, you had a change in the score of a little over 2.5, but you went down significantly more if you combined it with methylfolate. And then the other is a study that was at a higher dose, showing significantly more than twice the rates of improvement and remission and response if you used not only an antidepressant, but an antidepressant plus methylfolate. And in these studies, they were not even checking to see if people had the gene. They were just saying, let's just give it empirically to people who had, in the second study, it was people who had failed an antidepressant alone. Now, you might not have the gene, and you might still be a poor methylator if you're overweight. Having a body mass index of over 30, which is mild obesity, will cause the decrease in methylation the same as having 2 copies of that gene. If you have certain diseases like diabetes, and you have Crohn's, or you have hypothyroidism, or you drink too much, or you have the disease of being over 70, you're going to have less methylation. So sometimes we'll use methylation as a way of helping boosting neurotransmitters in people for a wide variety of reasons, not only because of their genetics. If you, again, are wondering, do you have depression, or does a loved one of yours have depression? It's shown that you can just ask the question of, have during the past 2 weeks you felt sad, felt like crying more easily, or have you had decreased interest in pleasurable activities? If you screen positive to these 2 questions, it is worth going and talking to a doctor about depression, because chances are that you are depressed. Let's move on to what about for stress and anxiety. So many of you have probably tried that old-fashioned treatment of desserts. Is stress spelled backwards? That is a bad idea for treating stress. It doesn't really work. In fact, if anything, it will cause you to have more cortisol release when your blood sugar goes up and then down again. But there are some natural things as well as medications that you can use to help treat for stress and anxiety. What you're going to see when we get to the third part is a lot of these same things that help you decrease your stress and decrease anxiety levels also help build new brain neurons. And so that's kind of convenient. So there are a lot of what are called adaptogens that help you deal with stress. An adaptogen is something that helps you adjust your levels. If you're having too high of cortisol levels, it tends to lower them. If they're too low of cortisol levels, it can also help bring them up. And so it helps the adrenal glands. But the adaptogens I'm going to focus most on today are theanine and ashwagandha, because those are ones that really help, particularly with good studies during times of stress. So theanine comes from green tea. And in the United States, if you go to a grocery store, you can find like dozens of things that have caffeine added to them. All the different Red Bull and the shots of things and, different bars for energy and drinks. In Japan, they value being calm rather than being revved up. And so you can find over 50 products in the average Japanese grocery store that are supplemented with theanine, because theanine increases your alpha relaxation waves, so kind of that meditative state. So it improves concentration, lowers stress, and it actually has been shown to improve memory. They studied it in the equivalent of some Japanese college students taking something that was kind of like an SAT, and showed that they got better scores and felt more calm during the test. In animal models, when you look at other neurotransmitters, you don't want to necessarily deal with stress by just GABA. That's kind of the sedatives, the benzodiazepines. And so by increasing alpha relaxation waves and not just kind of suppressing the brain is an advantage because you can feel calmer without suppressing memory. So a lot of the prescription things for memory will work on something called GABA, but those are related to sleeping pills. And so some of these other things are much better choices to start with. Theanine is over the counter. You can just drink green tea. A typical dose of theanine would be real green tea, two tea bags would be a usual dose of theanine, or you can get it in capsules, and it's usually, a typical dose is 50 to 250 milligrams. For most people to feel an effect, it's about 200 to 250, and you can take it up to twice a day. Now the thing about theanine is you do have to take it before the stressful event to block the stress. It won't fix it once you're stressed. And so usually if you know you're going to a stressful event, if you can take some theanine about 40 minutes beforehand, that can be very helpful. And it lasts most of the day. Next we're going to talk about ashwagandha. And ashwagandha is my favorite adaptogen, my favorite stress agent. Partially because I'm a scientist and I'm going to show you some of the research on it, and it has tremendous research. But also because it lowers cortisol levels. It is great for type A people. It helps you go into a stressful situation and not get that big stress response. And my family and friends will tell you, don't take my ashwagandha away. You could take anything else out of my home, but don't make me go into my work life without my ashwagandha or even visiting relatives, because it's wonderful for blocking stress and keeping everything calm. It's very safe. It comes from an Indian root that India, not Indian as a Native American, that is a form of ginseng called Withinia somniferum. And again, it's another adaptogen, and it works primarily by lowering cortisol. So in studies, ashwagandha lowered cortisol approximately 24%. That's a lot. That, to lower it, you need some cortisol. So to be able to lower it 24% is great. In the repeat trial, it was 27%. Now, I don't know how many of you here are statisticians, but when you're looking at whether something is a good product in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, we look at something called a p-value. And that lets us know how likely is it that the study was a good study and that the agent being studied actually separates from the control, from the placebo. And in order to get a medical product approved, you have to have a p-value less than 0.05, which means, and it's a relationship with 100, so a 0.05 means there's a 95% chance that that agent being tested really was better than placebo. On ashwagandha, the p-values for lowering stress, for decreasing depression, for decreasing anxiety were 0.0001 or less than that, which means there's a 99.99% chance that it actually worked better than placebo. And this was measured on day 60, but for most people, it separates by week 1, and some people with the first dose. So it's a pretty exciting thing. The studies, again, in my office, I don't recommend any products that don't have safety studies as well as double-blind placebo-controlled trials, because I feel like whether I'm talking about integrative medicine or prescribing a drug, we need to hold both sets of data to the same standards. So the ashwagandha trials were amazing. They were double-blind placebo-controlled trials, and you might say, well, they only had about 60 people in each group. But to get that kind of good data with only 60 people actually means the effect was stronger. In this study, the dose was 300 milligrams a day. That was of the actual powder. Mostly in America, you're going to find capsules, and the usual dose is 500 a day. And you'll find that, again, it lowered the perceived stress scale, the depression and anxiety scale, the global health questionnaire. And if you look at that, to improve DAS is the depression and anxiety subset, 71% reduction of the depression and anxiety scores, 41% reduction of perceived stress. That, for $14 for a month, is worth trying. And that's about how much ashwagandha costs for a bottle of 60 pills. So that's even if you're taking it twice a day. And again, here's the repeat study where it was shown almost 28% reduction in cortisol. So we have so much to cover here. I'm just kind of doing a little smidgen of all these topics. So that's kind of some of the ideas of things you can do for stress. But now what I want to do is switch over to memory, because everything that helps with mood and stress also contributes to a reversal of cognitive decline and in Alzheimer's disease and more. And these, again, are some of the work that from my studying with Dr. Dale Bredesen, who he started out as an Alzheimer's researcher. He has over 90 publications in the field of Alzheimer's in the basic science of it, of looking at the genetics with ApoE4, at looking at something called amyloid. And what happened is he noticed that in his 20-some years of being a researcher, over 243 of 244 new drugs failed. And he said, we must be doing something wrong. So he instead said, let's go back and look at all the different contributing factors, and instead of trying to change one thing at a time, let's try to figure out everything we know that contributes to the brain working well and to the signaling of cognition, and optimize all of them at once. And actually, just in case you guys were wondering, it's not getting any better with the research. In December of 2016, last month, another drug by Lilly failed for Alzheimer's. It was looking at lowering amyloid, which is actually what a lot of Dr. Bredesen's work was initially on, is amyloid plaques build up in the brain of Alzheimer's patients. So there's been a lot of work to, well, let's get rid of the amyloid. But as you can see, they got rid of the amyloid. They reduced amyloid deposits by 40%. But remember we were talking about p-values? The p-value for the study was 0.95, which means there is only a 0.05, there's only a 5% chance that it actually helped or improved cognition and that the study was real. So that's pretty sad. So he said, instead, I think the problem is that we're looking at a roof with 36 holes and we're trying to patch one hole. And as for that amyloid, it's kind of like saying that Doritos wrappers contribute to malnutrition or poor nutrition. It's not the Doritos wrappers, it's the kids who are eating the Doritos as their lunch. And so the amyloid is not the problem. Amyloid builds up when the brain is not having a healthy environment and you have inflammation and other signaling going awry. So he said, let's instead look at addressing as many of these different 36 parameters as we can. Now, some of them are ones we've already talked about. Lifestyle absolutely affects brain health. Sleep, getting 8 hours of sleep a night is actually one of the best things you can do for brain health. That is hard. I will agree, for people who have insomnia, that can be a hard problem to solve, but it is worth solving. Diet, having a low inflammatory, low sugar diet. In cases of when people are already having memory problems, we will encourage them to go as low on sugar and carbohydrates as they can. In our office, we will actually help people to get rid of so many carbohydrates that their diet is what we call low ketotic, that they're having a lot of healthy fats, proteins, and their carbohydrates are really mostly just what they get from vegetables and a little bit of fruit. We encourage people to fast. Now, fasting doesn't mean going days without food. Fasting means making sure that there's at least 12 hours between the time you have dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. 13 is even better. The reason for that is that there are certain signals that don't happen until your blood sugar gets really low. It's kind of like you can't really host a party and clean your house at the same time. It just doesn't work. So there is a cleaning process that happens at night in your brain that doesn't get signaled until it's been a large amount of time since you've eaten, so that the body knows that it's okay to switch to that autophagy cleanup process. Relaxation, meditation, lowering cortisol levels is a great thing to do. And for some people, that's listening to a meditation podcast at night. Other people actually practice meditation, yoga, things like that. And then exercise, which we talked about already. We also, in reversing cognitive impairment, need to address vitamin and hormone effects. Your thyroid hormones need to be in the ideal range, not just normal, but ideal, with free thyroid hormones also being ideal. Excuse me. You also need to have hormone signaling of the sex hormones of estrogen and testosterone if you're an ApoE4. I'm not going to go a lot into the genetics of Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment, but just like there's the MTHFR gene, there's a gene called ApoE4, which is just a carrier protein. So it's kind of like that carries cholesterol and is involved in that, but it's kind of like saying, what color basket do you have? Well, people who have ApoE4s are only 20% of the population, but they are 80% of individuals who have Alzheimer's before age 80. So that's a really important factor because that gene creates more inflammation. So those people, it turns out, do better having estrogen on board longer. That is not true for everybody else, but knowing some of your genetics can be helpful. Testosterone can help with cognition. It also helps with anxiety and sleep. Vitamin B12, vitamin D, vitamin K2, and then folate and methylfolate are also all important. I tell people if you're over 50, you should know your B12 levels. It actually has been shown that low B12 has about a 30% increased risk of cognitive impairment in individuals over 50. The reason it's so important to know your B12 levels is that if you are on an acid blocker, if you're on metformin, if you are a vegetarian, you are likely not absorbing the acid-soluble vitamin B12 as well as you should. And it's an $11 test. Now, that doesn't mean that Medicare covers it for every diagnosis, so talk to your doctors about getting it covered. But usually you can go fatigue or something. You know, if you're on an acid blocker, they can use a malabsorption code. And it's worth knowing. It's very, very safe. We're trying to aim for levels that are around 500 to 1,000. As far as we know, even if your levels are more than 2,000, there's no associated toxicity. Vitamin D is another really important hormone that you think of for your bones, but it's also very important for your heart and aging in general. What you see here on the side on the left is a mouse that doesn't have a normal vitamin D receptor. And so when they are given vitamin D, if they're given extra vitamin D, you can overcome that genetics. But if they're not, you'll see that same age mouse with the abnormal vitamin D receptor ages much more quickly. So unless you've done a lot of genetic analysis, you don't know how good your vitamin D receptors are. So again, it's worth at least once checking your vitamin D levels. And then you have to know, sometimes as the consumer, what level you're aiming for. 35 to 60 is ideal for bones. 50 to 100 is ideal for the brain. 45 to 70 is ideal for cancer risk reduction. So I usually try to aim in that overlap of about 50 to 60. What about that methylfolate that we talked about that helps with cognition on so many levels because it helps with mood? Well, if you also look at the role of methylfolate in memory, methylfolate is important there because methylfolate is involved. If you don't have enough methylfolate, you will make more of those neurofibrillary tangles, which some of you guys may have heard of when they look at the brains of people with Alzheimer's. There's other metabolic factors that also determine brain health. So inflammation is bad for the brain. We already said people with ApoE4 are more prone to inflammation. Exercise helps lower inflammation. Also, sugar is inflammatory for the brain. So that same thing we talked about before with diet helps lower inflammation. But there's also things like minerals like copper and zinc that are involved in the metabolism of the brain. What about mitochondria? How many of you guys remember ATP, powerhouse of the cell, mitochondria from when you were younger? That was probably like 7th grade, so it might be a while since some of you have looked at it. Well, I have a picture here of a mitochondria. It looks a lot like a bacteria, right? More like a bacteria than a human for sure. It turns out every neuron has at least 400 mitochondria when you're born, including all of those brain neurons. But there's a lot of things that can ruin the mitochondria or damage them. Because mitochondria have more DNA in common with bacteria than they do with humans, antibiotics can damage mitochondria. Pesticides can damage mitochondria. All kinds of things like anesthesia can damage mitochondria. I had a person coming in for a consult in my office who their history was, my wife had really great cognition until she had to have 4 surgeries because she had had a uterine cancer. And so there was a series of surgeries. And every time she had a surgery, her cognition got worse. And that's because anesthesia is not really great for her mitochondria. So mitochondrial health is real important because mitochondria make the energy for the neurons to do what they need to do. And the brain is just a collection of those electrical neurons. Now, mitochondria use some of the same things we use. They do use some of the B vitamins and zinc, but there's also a whole set of cofactors that mitochondria use that you need to replace if your mitochondria are getting sluggish. CoQ10, alpha-lipoic acid, N-acetylcysteine, acetyl-L-carnitine. There are products that you don't have to go and get all of these things separately. There are products, one that we use in our office is called K-Pax. It's K-Pax Mitonutrients for mitochondrial nutrients that put all these things together. But again, if you're kind of feeling tired, you're fatigued, you get muscle aches with statins, those are all signs that your mitochondria might not be in as great a shape. Mitochondria also just get sluggish by getting older. So, and again, when you talk about getting older, it's one of those things, as my dad always said, it's not great, but it beats the alternative. So, buildup of amyloid can be decreased with supplements. And it's not that we care about that amyloid. Remember, the amyloid's the Doritos wrappers. What we care about is that when the amyloid is being cleaved into 4 pieces down this beta pathway, so you'll see on your guys' right, there's the beta pathway where it gets cleaved into 4 pieces, and on the left is the alpha pathway. The beta pathway only happens when your brain says, you know what, we cannot add on to the house. We can't expand and add a guest room because the kitchen and the main part of the house is falling apart. So if your brain is having degradation and neurodegeneration and inflammation, your body says no more building. Well, you don't want your body to go down that pathway because what's going to happen is you're going to have trouble remembering what you had for lunch yesterday or what you read in a book last night because putting new things into memory gets difficult. So what we want is to have the signaling, the amyloid precursor protein, cleaved down the alpha pathway. And that can be promoted by ashwagandha as well as curcumin. And this was a lot of the work that Dr. Bredesen started with in his basic science life, is looking at amyloid precursor protein. So we talked about ashwagandha for stress, but ashwagandha has also been shown in double-blind placebo-controlled trials to help memory. It improved reaction time, digit substitutions, all kinds of things. And the interesting thing about this study, for those of you who say, my cognition's not too bad, it's not what it was 20 years ago, ashwagandha, this study was done in people in their 40s and 50s, not people with Alzheimer's. It also does help with people who have either mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's because it helps with that amyloid pathway, but it can help even the young. The usual dosing, as we said, for memory is 500 milligrams twice a day, and there's other good benefits to it. It's a very safe supplement. It also decreases certain kinds of cancers. It also can lower blood sugar and has been studied with other products in combination with things like Parkinson's. Sloan Kettering is studying it for its cancer benefits. So, how do we protect or improve cognition? You have to optimize many parameters. You can use drugs. We use thyroid hormone, we use metformin for blood sugars, but that's not the main solution. You want to look at many different parameters. The earlier you treat, the better outcomes you're going to have. So if you are for sure over 65, or if you're over 50 and you have a family history of Alzheimer's, you should ask your doctor to do a screener for memory. There's a couple, or you can get a friend to do it online. The SLUMS, which is a bad name but stands for St. Louis University Memory Screener, is online. It was developed by the VA and St. Louis University Medical School. And it's a 5-minute test that you can help differentiate mild cognitive impairment from normal memory or from Alzheimer's. There's also one called MOCA, which is free, called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And so that's important. Also, if you have problems with, learn what of your metabolic panel is off, what things need to be optimized. And you can get more about Dr. Bredesen's protocol at mpicognition.com. And his work was published in Aging in September in 2014. So I could go on and on about all these supplements, but I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. And so I am happy to take general questions about mood, memory, cognition. The supplements are fine.
My name's Barbara Hilliard, and I want to know, when you go to buy something like ashwagandha, how do you know that you're not getting something contaminated with lead or whatever?
That is a great question. So any supplements that come from India that are Ayurvedic supplements, that is a concern because they have shown to have higher levels of lead and arsenic in their soil. So what we do is in our office, we only carry brands that are standardized. So Pure Encapsulations is one great brand. And Pure Encapsulations uses the same kind of testing that voluntarily that pharmaceutical drugs go for to show that they are pure. And our office, our two offices, our websites are there, Resilient Health and Balcones Woods, and we have these products at both of our offices at less than retail, and you're always welcome to go by and say, I heard about ashwagandha and I want to get some. Like I said, at our office, the Pure Encapsulations brand is $14 for a bottle of 60. So you can get good quality supplements. You just need to make sure it's a company that standardizes.
Hi, my name's Carol Edwards. I wanted to find out if ashwagandha reacts with anything like omeprazole or Prilosec.
That's a great question. Does ashwagandha react with anything? So ashwagandha, the main thing that ashwagandha can affect is sometimes it can be a mild platelet inhibitor, which is kind of like aspirin. So the main group of people that I don't use ashwagandha for is I'm very cautious if they're on any kind of a blood thinner. So Plavix or some of the stronger blood thinners, I may or may not use them, but if you are on those, I absolutely would not use them without your doctor knowing and monitoring. Ashwagandha also can sometimes make your thyroid slightly more active, and so if you're on thyroid hormone, I do recommend after starting on ashwagandha about 6-8 weeks later checking because you might have to adjust the thyroid dose. It's also, there's a theoretical question of if it is good for pregnant women or if it could slightly increase the risk of miscarriages, so I don't use it in pregnant women. But there's no known contraindication with acid blockers.
Hello, I'm Cecilia Gurek. I'm a new patient at Balcones Woods, brand new. So I'm wondering, should I get my 23andMe already done prior and then come in and get a whole blood panel worked up? Because I'm really interested in all of this, just from not only a health perspective, but also from an intellectual perspective, as I'm a brain researcher.
So that's a good question, is who should get 23andMe done? So I don't know if you guys know what 23andMe is, but 23andMe is a Silicon Valley company that you swab the inside of your cheek, you send off a DNA sample, and 3 or 4 weeks later, they tell you where your relatives are from. But there's also a lot of medical data that can be downloaded that can give you your MTHFR gene, your ApoE. The thing you have to realize, they will give you data, if you look at it, raw data on 50,000 genes. No doctor is going to sit there in the office and go, oh, let's talk about all 50,000 of your genes. First of all, there's probably about maybe 100 that we know what to do about. And what we use genetic information for is when we see a family history and we're trying to, or personal histories, and we're trying to better assess the risk. So you can do 23andMe to find out your ApoE or your MTHFR. There are other ways of finding that out as well. For people who have heart disease in their family or personal history of high cholesterol, there is a lab called Boston Heart that is part of their cardiac panels will do those genetic tests. So people can go and do their 23andMe. Know that anyone who works with you at looking at it as from a physician standpoint is going to work backwards. They're going to say, you have some depression. If you're a poor methylator, that might make us use more methylfolate. But it's not as simple. We're at the very beginning of understanding medical genomics. But it is kind of fun to have it because then later you can go, I wonder if I have a vitamin D receptor abnormality because my vitamin D was low. but it's not necessary for medical treatment, and you can usually only deal with a few genes at an appointment.
Do you have any information about St. John's wort? Does it have any value?
So St. John's wort, does it have any value? So St. John's wort works on the serotonin receptors. It is in the same family as Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft. So as I said at the beginning, I'm an integrative medicine physician. One of the most important things to understand about integrative medicine is that we do not throw away everything we learned in medical school and residency when we get that second board certification. And the reason that I don't use St. John's wort is because of its safety profile. There's no advantage over Paxil, Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, and there are more safety problems and drug interactions with St. John's wort. So if I have somebody who absolutely won't take a SSRI, or they say they don't tolerate it, I'm not going to go to say, well, let's take St. John's wort instead, with the one possible exception of some of the teas that are meant for mood do use a little bit of St. John's wort. That's not usually enough to cause a side effect. So if somebody wants to do that and they feel like it helps them, it gives them a little bit of serotonin activity. But I would not recommend using St. John's wort in place of something like Celexa.
Do you differentiate between generalized stress and depression versus specific timing, like recently with the elections and all that? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I can't tell you how many of my family members had reflected how much more stress and depression they were having about a little over, somehow mid-November. So anyway, so yes and no. So there are some people who genetically are predisposed to depression because of their gene makeup, and then there are other people who they will feel depressed or feel stressed because of specific events. Political events, lifestyle cycle events, like having grief and loss. And so, yes, it's a little bit different in terms of how long I'm going to treat them for that event, but when I have somebody, and a lot of times people are like, oh, I just want to get over my depression myself. They're grieving, they lost their spouse. That's an extraordinarily stressful time. And they're like, no, I'm not, it's just because of that. I don't want to take medicines. I actually encourage people to do whatever it takes with supplements, medications, exercise, to get over their stress or depression, no matter what the triggering factor is, because all of them are associated with neuron loss. The difference is somebody who has genetic predisposition to depression and has chronic depression, I'm going to keep them on something to keep their neurotransmitter levels high, at least for months, but most likely years. By the time somebody has had 3 episodes of depression, the guidelines are actually to keep them on something to recycle their serotonin levels for life. Now, with the knowledge that we now can use things like Deplin or other forms of L-methylfolate to keep neurotransmitter levels high, sometimes I get people off, but they're still on something. There might be a supplement, but it's real important. The most important thing is if you're having an episode of depression, get yourself not just better, so a 50% improvement is called response. Getting back to normal is called remission. Get yourself to remission, because that's what protects your brain. Get yourself feeling well, and don't be too proud to use medications, supplements, exercise, counseling, all those things to help you get there.
You mentioned early on that stress can lower BDNF levels, and psychotherapy has been shown in medical studies to lower stress. So my question, as an integrated physician, have you looked into psychotherapy as an integrated component in this treatment?
Absolutely, and I should have put that up there. That's a very good point. So cognitive behavioral therapy has been the most well-studied of the different types, and therapy absolutely lowers both cortisol levels, stress, and improves BDNF and decreases depression and improves remission. In fact, for mild depression, there was no advantage in studies of using antidepressants versus using psychotherapy. So for mild depression, psychotherapy is often all that you need to get well. So thank you for bringing that up. I should add that to my slides.
I'd like to know, are there recent books or journals that a non-professional, intelligent layman can read to keep up with these things?
That's a great question. So the University of Washington, they have a very good integrative medicine website. Their director, Dr. Rakel, R-A-K-E-L, wrote one of the integrative medicine textbooks. So there's a whole series of handouts on the University of Washington website on integrative medicine. University of Arizona, which is one of the main fellowships, Andrew Weil runs the fellowship, or did run the fellowship at University of Arizona. He has a lot of patient handouts. If you're interested in the cognitive, Dr. Bredesen has on his website quite a bit for lay people, but there's also a site of apoe4.info wiki that was brought to my attention that also has a very clear explanation of Dr. Bredesen's work, and it has hyperlinks so you can click on the references. So if you're kind of a science person, that's a great website to go to as well to look at this material. So there's a lot of it out there. I think that the thing to be careful of is any time before you put something into your body, you need to look, and just even if you start with Google and then later you go to looking at there is PubMed, which is the published medical literature. You want to make sure that whatever you're putting in your body has some science behind it, that there's studies showing both safety and efficacy, because we want to do a better job than Dr. Google, because you can find anything on the web.
I take 10 or so supplements a day. No, I take them every other day to save money. So I figure I'm paying half price. And I wondered if that's totally self-defeating with the spilling daily in the urine, and is nothing stored? I know it's individual, but overall, what do you think?
So let's talk about just supplements in general. A lot of people, so when you are deciding what you're going to do for your own health, you need to, in choosing supplements, kind of put in your family history, what you're trying to achieve, what your goals are. And so I think that you can take supplements every day. You're going to have more benefit than not taking them at all. But usually if you kind of look at which ones are most important, that would probably be the strategy I would take with a patient. So for example, curcumin, which I actually did not talk about, is a good example. Curcumin helps to cleave the amyloid precursor protein down the proper pathway, but it also helps with arthritis. It also has been shown to decrease oxidized LDL and help decrease cardiac disease. It also has been shown to decrease over 70 different types of cancers. So that might be something that someone who has a family history of some of those things would choose. By the way, if you're looking at curcumins, you need a highly absorbable one. So there's a kind Mariva, which is attached to phosphatidylcholine. There are some other different curcumins. And on our website, on our Balcones Woods website, there was a short integrative medicine talk I gave, and I just highlighted 5 different kind of compounds, and curcumin was one of them, ashwagandha was one, so you can get a lot of the brands and information there. But if you're choosing something, look at what else it can help. So ashwagandha, like we said, had cancer, so you want to look and kind of use supplements. Vitamin K2 and vitamin D help with bones, but also help with brain. And choose things wisely and do your research, but I think that you can use a few supplements wisely, and sometimes you're on a lot of things that you really like, why am I on it? I don't know.
I'm somewhat familiar with the Walsh Institute. Are they leaders in this emerging field? And also, is it not a good idea just to be taking acetylcholine or phosphatidylserine? Are they not as effective as some of the supplements you're talking about?
So you're clearly an educated consumer asking about some of these specifics. Everything depends. So phosphatidylserine is often in acetyl. So some of these are can't just take. So acetylcholine, taking it, remember there's that whole blood-brain barrier. So it's more about synthesizing it. So we will use methylfolate to help push that synthesis. We also will use choline in the form of, it has to be a choline that's CDP choline, because it has to be an absorbable choline that will get into the brain and push that synthesis of acetylcholine. So from what I know, the studies, that's much more effective than taking acetylcholine. And again, I was just kind of giving a little smattering of ideas. There are over 30 different supplements that we can use for helping the brain, but CDP choline is actually an interesting one because it does help repair nerves that have been damaged, particularly in people who have had small strokes or any kind of ischemic, which means low oxygen injury, and helps memory in seniors as well. Phosphatidylserine There are studies in it. I tend to use that more in sleep combination products. It's not one that has, but again, if sleep is your issue, that might be something I would use. So at our office, it's kind of funny because I started 20 years ago in family medicine and private practice, and now I do full-time long appointments, integrative medicine, and in Resilient Health's our integrative office in Balcones Woods is our more general. And at both of them, actually, the wall of all the supplements that we have, because we have them there so that our patients can get them more easily, is much bigger than the prescription drugs. And so over the years, the drug reps just have dwindled down because they know that I really don't use nearly as many. But we have over 100 different things that we use on a monthly basis. So I think that it really depends on, because people are individual, it really depends on what the person's issues are.
I think the challenge I'm having as a stroke survivor in my 20s is, in dealing with cognitive damage and figuring out how to repair. But I'm also presented with this paradox of choices because we have so many potential options now, from supplements to diet to microbiome to exercise, community aspects, and so forth. So are there just maybe 2 or 3 things that you'd recommend in closing that we look at as a starting point?
So that's a topic we didn't really talk a lot about, is people who've had strokes as a cause of their cognitive damage. That's the same as traumatic brain injuries. And the thing that I would have to say is strokes depend on whether it was a hemorrhagic versus ischemic. But in general, stroke, you're looking at repairing neurons. And so I, of course, can't answer specific medical, but when patients come to me and talk about neurodegeneration after strokes, acetylcholine is one thing that's really important. K-PAX, which is the mitochondrial nutrients, are really important because you had part of the brain not get enough oxygen for whatever cause, and you're trying to bring those neurons that have some survivability back online. But other things, there is a product that comes from broccoli sprouts extract called sulforaphane. The best brand of it is the one that came out of Johns Hopkins, in my opinion, called Admocol. And so anyway, sulforaphane has been shown to help with traumatic nerve injury and brain damage as well. So there's a lot of different things that can be used.
Dr. Hausman-Cohen, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today. Thank you very much. We appreciate your information, and hopefully all of us will go out of here feeling better and know what we can do.
And go home and exercise.